Hey, Donovan Keith here, and in this video I want to introduce you to how you can use scene nodes to build your own simple stair spline primitive that you can easily adjust, including things like step height, depth, and it is a fully extrudable spline that you can do any number of things with. Now, if your goal is to create just finished looking stairs, may I recommend opening up your assets browser and searching for stairs. Inside of here, you're going to find a variety of presets, including some made with the stair spline generator, or excuse me, the stair primitive created by Rocket Lasso, which has got a number of features like adjusting your step count, the width, the height, depth, the thickness of each individual stair, options like the thickness around these things. You can add nosing. Really, the world is your oyster here. And if you take a look at this example file, which is a Max on 1 exclusive, you'll see a variety of specific stairs that have been created using this setup. So the techniques that we're going to go over in this video are going to go over, they're going to teach you the basics of how you might approach a project like this, but at a much simpler starting point than trying to take on as big a problem as that. So let's go ahead and begin, and let's talk about really sort of like a general strategy. How might we approach this? And really what I'm thinking about something like this, I often start on paper. In lieu of paper, let's talk through this in, let's say, my right-hand view here. So what are stairs? What do they look like? Well, I'm going to take my doodle here, and let's just kind of paint and talk. So stairs usually have a starting point. And they kind of, if memory serves, they kind of look like this. Although they could also look a bit more like this, where it's a little bit longer and going up. But in general, I'm doing sort of the same thing over and over again, right? I am starting in a place, and then I'm either walking up, or I'm walking over, and then I'm walking up, and then I'm walking over. And you can think about what we're doing here as a series of directions that we're traveling. So I might walk up a certain amount, and then I might walk back on the z-axis here a certain amount, up again on y, that same amount, and back on z, that same amount. So we're going to need a couple of variables or parameters that a user can set to adjust these things. So we're going to need a step height. Right, that's an H. Believe me, please. And then we've got a step depth. Right, so how deep is this step that we're walking? And eventually, we're going to get this overall stairs height, but that's something that we can just kind of get automatically by walking our steps. And then at the very end, we're going to probably want to connect all of these things together somehow. So starting at the origin here, we walk up height units, we walk over depth units, we walk up height units, we walk over depth units. And we can sort of build that out in scene nodes using something called the loop carried value node. So to begin, let's go ahead and create a new project file. Go ahead and switch to your node's layout so that you can easily see your node editor. Grab your console and drag it over. I'm just doing this so I've got more view area. I'm going to click on Attributes so I can see my settings here. And I'm going to hit Shift-C and search for Nodes Spline and drag that into my Objects Manager. Now that I've got my node spline, I want to start building a spline, right? That's going to be my final output, so I know that that's something I'm going to want to do. So I'm going to double-click in my node editor, and I'm going to search for spline. And there's a whole bunch of different spline primitives, geometry utilities, all sorts of different things. The one that I want is something called Assemble Spline, and this is what you would use if you want to create a spline from scratch. So I'm going to grab my Assemble Spline, drag it out. And at the far right-hand side here, I have got a geometry port, which I can connect here to geometry. And inside of my Assemble Spline, I've got some options for points, segments, tangents, corners. And I don't want to worry about all of that. I'm just trying to create a simple linear spline. So I'm going to change my Assemble Splines type from Bezier to linear. So now I've got fewer things I need to worry about. And the first thing that I see here is a port called points, and a couple of things to point out about it. First, it ends in an S, so it's pluralized. It means there's more than one thing here. And then to the left, the little icon on the port also indicates this. A lot of our ports have got a single element, a single shape, like the geometry there. But these have got these 4 shapes, and that just is sort of a visual indicator like, hey, we're going to be trying to build something out of a bunch of something. And this a bunch of something, if you click on where it says points right here, is of the type array vector 64. So array, you can think of that as a list, and vector 64, vector you can think of as something like the position vector, right? X, Y, Z. So it is a point in space is what we're going to be getting here in X, Y, Z coordinates. So how do we get the points for this? Well, there's a few different ways. Let's start by building this manually, just sort of mocking up very manually how we would build this thing, and then we'll figure out how to do it automatically. So there is a node for this. If I double click, I can search for something called build array. And the build array tool, or node rather, lets me create an array that I can pipe into here. Now, to start, it doesn't really look like much. I don't have anything that looks like one of these array ports. And that's because I need to specify the element type. So I'm building an array or a list of something, and I need to say it is a list of what? And it is going to be a list of vectors. So now we see that it sort of changed here to be an array out. It's got the same icon as this over here, so I'm going to connect my array out to my points. And as I look at this over here, I've got a bunch of empty fields that I can fill out. And if you just start kind of dragging these around, you're going to find that you've got the ability to create your own spline. So the first point is at 0, 0, 0, which sort of works for me. Then the next one comes up. The next one I kind of want to get flat with it, right, to sort of look like a stair. The next one I'm going to want to move it back on Z, move it up. Let's append or add another element at the end here. Oh, we got to move that over to the same amount. Whoops, excuse me, not on X, but on Y. Let's move it up, and let's move it over like so. And as we do this, we see that there's some patterns that are starting to emerge. They might not be perfect yet in the numbers. So this X value is staying 0 the whole time, right? We're not moving the points over on X, but the Y value is increasing. So we see a 33 and a 34. That's just sort of the imprecision of me. So I'm going to type in 30 and 30 for these two. So now we've got a nice flat section. Next up, I've got this depth over here of 65. Let's say that's 60. Let's set the depth for this next one to 60, right? So it's the same amount. And then we were going up 30 units the first time. It looks like we're going up 80 to 80. Let's actually just go up to 60 to 60. And then this final one over here, we're going to want to set that to, let's say, 120. So we're going up in increments of 30 in height, and it looks like we're going in increments of 60 in depth. Let's just add one more point. Let's start at that same value, 60, 120, and then we're going to go up another 30, so 60 plus 30. And then we're going to go and leave it there. Let's append another value. Let's start with those same numbers. 90, 120, and then let's add another 60 to it, so 180. So we've sort of manually built a list of points and how we would expect them to sort of function and what we'd want them to do. So let's think about how we could do this systematically, which we've kind of already talked through, right? We need to define that height value and that depth value. In this example that we just sort of improvised, we've got a height value of 30 for each step, and then a depth value of 60 per each step. So we're going back 60 units each time. So we could continue to do this manually, but that's no faster and, in fact, a bit slower and a bit uglier than just drawing this by hand. So how can we automate the process of building up an array like this? Well, in order to do it, we are going to do something called looping. We are going to do the same thing over and over and over again, and we're going to take in the result of the previous value each time. So in order to do this, we want to figure out how many times we want to loop. So to do this, we would need, let's say for each step, 1, 2, 3. We'd need 3 total loops or iterations. So to make these sorts of loops, there is a node that we need, and that node is something called range. So I'm going to double click in here, and I'm going to search for range. The range node allows me to go from my starting value to just before my ending value. So if I type in 3 right here, the result of this, and if you want to visualize the result of this, you can add a text spline, let's say. And with my text spline, I'm going to open up this little field by command clicking on that dot. I'm going to plug in my range. I'm going to output like so. And now we get a bunch of values right on top of each other. And that's because each one of these loops is adjusting the text, and that's being output. Now, if I right-click on where it says range right here, first I want to make sure that my capsule or my node spline over here is selected. I'm going to select range, right-click, and choose Data Inspector. And this is going to bring up a window that shows me every single loop or iteration. So 0, 1, 2. If I change this to 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So with this sort of computer programming style of interaction, counting starts at 0. It doesn't start at 1. And then it goes up to just before the last number that we set, so just before 5. So let's go ahead and adjust our capsule here so that this end value is a number that someone can punch in. So I'm going to just drag over where it says end and release and choose add new input. And I'm going to call this step count. So our step count is 5. Next up, what we are going to do is add a series of points together and use them for our spline. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I'm going to show you a way that is actually probably not the best way to do this, but it is. This is for illustration purposes. So I am going to double-click and search for append elements. And append elements takes in as an input an array. So it takes in an array of something. And then on the output, it has an array. So let's give it an array. Let's take this build array. I'm just going to get rid of all of the elements by clicking on truncate, which is like saying delete here. So I've got an empty array of vectors or positions. I'm going to wire that to my append elements. And append is basically saying stick something on the end and then return the result. So I'm going to take my range here, this sort of counting up to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to pipe that number here into where it says value. And then the end result of this is going to be ideally an array of values that if I wire into my text spline, we'll sort of see what's happening here. So what we're getting is a series of positions, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4. And if we unfold our value here, we see that what's happening is these counting numbers are being assigned to a vector. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to the x value, the y value, the z. So let's just set it to the z value. And now we get something like this. So the other thing that you'll see is this sort of like curly bracket with 3 dots and another curly bracket with 3 dots. Anytime you see this, it's pretty important that you try and close these brackets. This is what's called a scope. And it's just saying, hey, I'm going to start doing a lot of something. And at the other end, you want to make sure that you catch that a lot of something. So I'm taking this wire here. I'm wiring it in. And this is basically saying, this range is paired with this append elements. it's not really needed in this exact instance, but if we had a more complex setup, you could accidentally run into a scenario where you've got one thing counting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, another thing counting 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then you'd be getting 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, I'm not doing a good job of counting those off, but it could be a bad thing. So we're just wiring together these two scopes, so we know that every time we count, we're going to append a new element, and the end result of all of that, we're just turning into some text that we can output. Now, what would happen if we wanted to turn that into a spline? Well, you would take your assemble spline right here, and you would take the array that we've created, this list of point positions, wire it into points, take the output of our geometry, wire it into geometry, and now we have got, well, it doesn't seem like we have much, but if I tap the H key, what you will see is, oh, we've actually got a series of points that are coming along the z-axis. And if we look at the y values, we are getting those numbers going up along y as well. So this works really well for linear things or things where you can easily make a formula. But what I want to do is think about this in adding one step at a time. And I just want to make one step and then go over, and then wherever the last one ended, I want to kind of like go up and go over, and wherever the last one ended, I want to go up and go over. And for that, I'm going to use a special node called loop carried value. So loop carried value is a tool that you can use to do the same thing over and over again, and to calculate one value based on the number that you just calculated, or to take an operation and do something again. So an example of what this might look like in Cinema 4D, let's say, right, is let's say I have a polygon, and I select this polygon, and I do an extrude. Whoops. So that first extrude is just one thing. Now, if I was to do like a loop carried value, I would just take the result of that previous extrude, and in my next loop, I might extrude again. Oh, we're going to do another loop. Oh, let's just do that same operation again. Oh, we're going to do another loop. Let's do the same operation again. And that's effectively what we're going to do with loop carried value, except what we're going to be doing is sort of building our step and going over, and building our next step and going over, and building our next step and going over, something like that. But we're just doing it with the spline. So to bring in loop carried value, double click in this area right here and search for loop carried value. Loop carried value again takes in an input on one side, and it gives you an output on the other side. And inside here, you can sort of say what you want to do each step. So there's a couple of ways that we could do this. I like to generally have, for things like this, a variable that I call cursor. So I'm going to take this variable 1, I'm going to rename it cursor, because I like to think of just kind of like what I would do with my mouse as I'm working. How am I moving my individual sort of working point along? The other thing that you can do is to add another variable, and that variable or input is going to be an array of vectors, like the points that we're trying to form here. So take my loop carried value, I'm going to choose to add input. Right here it says types 2, and what I can do is, it's a vector by default. I can click on this little arrow right here, or rather unfold it. I can click on this little arrow right here and choose insert above array. And what it's going to do is, instead of just having a vector as my type, it's now making an array as the type of what I'm working with. So here I'm just going to rename this to points. And there's this types area here. I can sort of hide that. And what I want to do is start my build array here with my points. And at the other end here, let's take this array. I'm going to take it, and I'm going to just plug it straight into my assemble spline over here. And let's delete this append elements. And we need to feed this loop carried value. We need to give it a couple of things. The most important thing that we can give it is one of these scope ports, one of these curly brackets from a range or an iteration of some kind. So I'm going to take this over here. And so now it's saying every time the range counts, do what's inside of here. So I've got my build array. And you know what? Let's just add a first point here. So point 0, we can call it origin, right? It's 0, 0, 0. And inside of our loop carried value, we are going to want to append or add an additional point at the end of the points here. So let's go into our loop carried value. And I'm going to take my cursor, which is my current position, and I'm going to add a value to it. So I'm going to take my add, I'm going to change it to a vector. I'm going to take my cursor, and let's walk over, or actually let's walk up, let's say 20 units. And I'm going to call this add height. And then I'm going to duplicate this node right here. And I'm going to say that this is add depth. And right here, instead of going up 20 on Y, I'm going to go, let's say, 60 on Z. So I've got add height, add depth. And there's a couple of ways that I can approach this. I could choose to append and then append. But I think what I want to do is another operation for sticking something on the end of an array. And that operation is something called concatenate, to take this one thing and to stick it together with another thing. So we're jamming these two lists together. So I'm going to search for concatenate, bring this out, and we have a first array field. So I'm going to take my points and drag it here. And then we've got a second array field. And this is something that I need to work out somehow. So I need to build an array or create an array that I can jam in here. So I'm going to create a build array. Set the type here to vector. I'm going to call this step start, step end. And so the first start of my step, I'm going to drag this add height, right? So just to sort of paint out where we are, right? So over here, our very first point is point 0, right? So this very first point, if we go up a level, the build array, that's our origin. So that's 0. Now, we add our height. So again, right here, I'm going to add we add the height value. And that's this point right here. So that's going to be point 1. And then we add our depth. That's going to be point 2. And that add depth goes right here as the second point in our build array. I might rename this build step. And I'm going to add this as the next array in my concatenate. So we take at the very beginning, it's just this single point. We then choose to create an array, right? This 2-point array for the start of the step and the end of the step. We're adding it to this initial point with the concatenate. And then we're taking the result of this, and we are adding it over here to points. So then we're setting ourselves up to do it again. Additionally, I want to take our cursor, right, this position that's sort of like, let me just paint this maybe in purple to match, right? So we've got our cursor that starts out over here at the origin. Then it's going to walk up. It's going to walk over. That's step 1. And then it's going to do this for step 2. It's going to do this for step 3. But it will only do this if we update this starting point at the end of each step. So what we have to do is take the position that we've created after we've added height and added depth, and we need to wire it into this cursor output. And now we have something that is actually looking pretty close to what we want. We have the ability to come in here and adjust our height. We have the ability to adjust our depth. And the only thing we really feels lacking is this sort of closing out at the bottom here. So we'll just go ahead and do something to our assemble spline here. I am going to take the last point, right? So I'm going to grab the last point right here, and there's a way to grab that point. There's a node called pop. Or actually, let me try something. I don't think that this is going to work, but I just want to try it really quickly. Can I do a get element? Oh, I can do a get element with a negative index, which would get the, let's just use pop. That's going to be simpler. So I'm going to use pop element. So pop element gets the very last item in your array, right? This value right here. And I'm just going to append or stick this onto this one right here. So I'm going to pop the last element right back where it started. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the y height. So I'm grabbing the last point. I am now going to stick another copy of it onto the end, which I'm doing with the append elements here. And I am going to move it down on y to y0. And to do that, I'm just going to use a value node. I'm going to call this 0. And plug that into y0. And now I have got the last point gets copied and moved down here. And now we've got something that looks like this. Now to close our spline, we do that by clicking on our node spline, going to the subdivision tab, and turning on close spline. And all of a sudden, we have got a setup that is based on our step count, increasing the number of steps. And then depending on what we're doing here inside of the loop carried value, we are adjusting our height and we are adjusting our depth. Now, if we want to make these values user controllable, what we can do is unfold add height. And it's the y value that we care about. So I'm going to drag that out from here, release, and choose add new input. Let's call this step height. Add depth. We see it's this third value, the z value that we care about. So I'm going to unfold this, drag out that z, and call this step depth. And back here, I've got my step height and my step depth. I am going to take these values and we're going to sort of control them. But you know what? I want a nice clean input with numbers and so forth, like centimeters and units and all that. So to make that happen a little bit more easily for myself, I'm going to double click and search IO size, and I get a nice preset here that I can drag out. So one preset, choose preset. I'm going to call this height. Let's see. Yeah, height is the first thing we do, and then depth. And let's just, I'm going to take height and depth, and I'm going to drag, I'm selecting both of them. I'm going to drag them out, and I'm just going to wire them in here. And we now have a pretty sort of chonky set of stairs, but we can adjust the height per step and the depth. And we can call this, I guess, step height, step depth. And you now have a set of stairs, or at least a spline, that you can easily adjust. You've got to count for the number of steps. And this is the principle that you would follow to make your own step-based spline operations, your own step primitives. So if you want, you can, for example, extrude this, adjust the amount, and so on. Now, if you're building a project and you just need steps that look exactly like this, what should you do? Well, you should, you could draw the spline manually, or you could use the step or the stairs preset. But by going through this together, I think that you now have a core set of skills that you can use in a bunch of different scene nodes projects. And you also have access to this spline, whenever you want it in the future. Just open up this project file and copy it out. We can call this our stairs spline. And feel free to go in there and continue to tweak your network, continue to adjust your presets and so forth. Yeah, I hope that you found this tutorial helpful. We did cover a lot of ground here, and I'm going to bring up a, let me just grab another browser here. I'll bring it over in just a moment. Core 4D. There is a tutorial series by Core 4D, which is a forum as well for Cinema 4D users with lots of great information. And they've got some playlists. One of them is on basic TD skills. And inside of here, you're going to find, aside from this advertisement, you are going to find a series of tutorials on things like iterations and arrays and iterations. So if some of this was a little bit confusing, if you need a little bit more information about like vectors or points and so forth, this is a really great series of introductory content that will go over how to do this sort of work and go from there. So this loop carried value workflow that we're going through is a more advanced workflow in scene nodes, but it is the key to creating a lot of really cool effects where you're taking in the result of one step and then using it to influence the next step. All right. Thank you very much for your time. If you've got any questions, please post them. And I'd also love to see anything that you make, either by following this directly or inspired by this. Okay, bye-bye.